Despite food prices having been higher in recent years, Manx agriculture continues to face significant challenges. Closures of Ramsey Bakery and Shoprite have impacted on Manx food sales in the Isle of Man. The meat plant continues to face significant problems, and recently the Department of Infrastructure has imposed huge increases in charges to remove fallen stock from Manx farms. Yesterday I went to the Southern District Agricultural Show and I caught up with the President and General Secretary of the Manx National Farmers Union and the Department of Environment, Food and Agriculture's new Chief Officer, Scott Gallagher. We'll hear from the Farmers Union later, but first, Scott Gallagher. Who is he and where does that accent come from?
Look, depending on probably which time of the day it is, you might be hearing a bit of New Zealand or a bit of Scots. So I was born in Scotland, and then my folks moved us out to New Zealand when I was 4.5. So this is as good as the Scots is, or as strong as the Kiwi is. And then growing up in New Zealand, I grew up on farms. So we were up the top of the North Island in New Zealand, and right through most of my childhood, right until I went to university, we had a range of farms, and I've just loved working within and for the agricultural sector.
And for people who don't know, of course, in the part of the world you came from, subsidies of any kind really were quite a rare thing to come across, weren't they?
Well, they were. There was a government, an incoming Labour government in the early 1980s, around 1984, that New Zealand was essentially bankrupt, and they had to make some big calls. And they make big calls for the agricultural sector, had a huge impact. And to this day, sometimes you look around some of our communities, you can continue to see the impact in New Zealand. But what it did do was actually then the birth of a whole lot of different sectors, whether it's the New Zealand wine industry and viticulture, horticulture, kiwi fruit, through to venison and the deer industry, and also just led to a whole lot of adjustments that they made. But it was difficult for the agriculture sector and farmers. And it was also particularly hard for a lot of communities, because a lot of communities, at the same time the government rolled out the change in terms of subsidies for agriculture, they also embarked on a huge economic liberalisation campaign, which also resulted in significant shifts and pressures on a lot of rural communities.
So you have then experience, presumably you've shorn sheep, and have you milked cows and things like that?
My upbringing, it was so eclectic, I think you could range everything into it. We had dairy cattle, sheep, goats, dry stock, you name it, we had a crack at it, and I loved it. And then particularly when I was in my high school years, and I worked a lot on a range of farms. It would just so happen that at the time that I was about to go to university, kiwi fruit was quite large, so I ended up working a lot on kiwi fruit orchards up in Northland.
And I suppose the reason that's important is it's fair to say that there's a degree of scepticism amongst Manx farmers, maybe after years and years of experience of young, bright things coming from across with loads of really good ideas, telling them how they need to run their farms, and experience showing them that not all of these things worked. You obviously have experience, so you bring something to the table that many of your predecessors perhaps didn't have.
I mean, I look at it that, we're all the sum of all our experiences. I treasure all my experiences working on farms, but right throughout my career, at various times throughout my career, whether in government or in the private sector, I've ended up working for farmers and for the agricultural sector. I appreciate what the commercial pressures are. I appreciate all of the pressures on agricultural sectors, whether it's in the island here or elsewhere. And I've just had a privilege right throughout my career to be able to have the opportunity professionally, albeit that I'm not actually working the land, but professionally to actually be working with farmers, for farmers, and really thinking about how we can actually make that difference. And actually, I'm really passionate about providing people with far more optimism in terms of the future.
What do you see as the risks to the agricultural industry on the island at the moment, and what's DEFRA's role in helping farmers overcome those risks?
I think I'd probably start with the latter part of the question there, Phil. I think DEFRA's role is fundamentally to be a partner, to be an advisor, but fundamentally it's a partner for farmers and for the sector. I absolutely appreciate, and in the 9 months I've had so far, I absolutely appreciate the pressures, and I also very much understand that recent years have been hard. What I'm about is making sure the department is working hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder with farmers in the wider sector to actually have optimism about the future and to progressively run down these issues. Clearly what I've heard a lot since I've been on the island and then been out and about catching up with a lot of farmers is, we do have serious things to sort out in terms of access to market. What's impressed me across the island is we have the most outstanding produce. We have such passion on this island, and yet I do understand that access and route to market, whether here on the island or across and into other jurisdictions, is difficult. And I'm really committed to make sure the department is working with the sector to turn this around and actually deliver people an access and route to market that they deserve to have.
Quite clearly, we had a supermarket on the Isle of Man, Shoprite, which claimed to be Manx to the max. It wasn't on all occasions, but it did a pretty good job of that. It certainly did an excellent job in encouraging Manx consumers to want to buy Manx produce. It made it very easy for them to buy it. Obviously, Shoprite has sold out now. Tesco has taken over. Tesco is a much more its operating model is dependent on selling food at a price that it can make profit, and not necessarily helping its producers to sell their wares.
Remarkably, I think it was my third week in this role.
So it's all your fault then?
No, but I remember getting a call that there was an announcement. And it was clear right at that stage that the department, we needed to double down and actually work with people. I know there's a lot of questions at that time, and people still have questions. We've been doggedly working with Tesco and others across government to ensure that Tesco's door is open, and that as much local produce we can get across the line can. I know it's been some difficult conversations, but what we ended up doing, and I think it's been very successful so far, was all the support we've been providing businesses in terms of getting the right accreditation so they can at least be in play for Tesco. There's more we need to do, and that fundamentally is really making sure that we are partnering with producers to make sure that we leave no stone unturned so their ambitions and aspirations can be realized. And we're just first couple of steps here. I am not saying it's all tickety-boo and hunky-dory. It is the first few steps. We do have Manx produce in the new Tesco stores. We would love to have more. We know that Tesco remains committed and open to having more. We just need to make sure we are just ceaselessly working with our local producers to make sure we can realize and they can realize their own aspirations.
And I suppose from Tesco's point of view, they have gone from having one store on the Isle of Man, which has operated very clearly and firmly under Tesco's UK-wide, and I'm including the Isle of Man, knowing full well we're not in the UK, but maybe Tesco views it in a slightly different way. In terms of their distribution network and how their policies work, we have been viewed very much as anywhere else that their network serves. Things will be a little bit different for them now too, because they now have a much greater responsibility in relation to the supply of food across the island. There are obviously other supermarkets and other chains, but I think even they would have to acknowledge that Tesco now is the biggest.
Yeah, I think as you note, that there comes with that a responsibility, and to be honest, I've been mightily impressed. I think Andy from Tesco, he is absolutely committed to make sure that Tesco can have a variety of local produce in play. And the interesting thing, and again, it's something we're working with people, is that going into Tesco, Tesco themselves have said they don't need some of our local producers to feel as though they have to then go from 0 to 1,000 and be in every store. We can start in nice small steps, and so that's the opportunities we see, that we can actually start small, maybe 1 or 2 of the stores to start with until people can get established, and then they'll be able to develop from there. The key thing is I just need to make sure the department is absolutely working with people. I'm all about making sure we're partnering in the right way.
And of course, one of the things that you have been able to do is help food suppliers in terms of ensuring that they can comply with some of Tesco's standards. And Tesco will quite reasonably say, we have certain standards, in terms of auditing food and what level of quality and everything needs to be demonstrated. We have these standards because actually we don't want to put our consumers at risk. Therefore, it makes sense for us to expect farmers to meet certain standards. That's not to say that Shoprite didn't have standards as well, but they had a different level of responsibility, perhaps. So you've been able to help producers go through the quite expensive rigmarole and bureaucracy of ensuring that their product fits in with Tesco's policies.
Oh, absolutely. And that was one of the key things we needed to do up front when they announced the Tesco taking over Shoprite, was to actually just make sure that no one on the island was going to be left behind. No one on the island was going to have to try to get those sort of accreditations without us basically coming in financially and saying, no, we've got you. We want to empower our producers. I think the remarkable thing, and I'm conscious we've spoken a bit about Tesco, the remarkable thing, which again, when you have these sort of announcements or milestones, is you typically don't know all the other opportunities that play out. And I think what we've seen, if you go into some of the other stores we have on the island, people have responded. So you look at Robinson's, the great stuff that Robinson's has done, and since the Tesco announcement, to really give an even stronger platform for local producers. And you look at how some of our producers have really seized some opportunities that they might have decided, we might not be in Tesco, but actually we're going to have a stronger footprint in the other avenues and the other channels. That's amazing. And I think, reflecting on a lot of the commentary at the time when this was announced, I don't think we fully appreciated the dynamic nature of our producers and the island. I think we have to be quite proud that a lot of our producers in the island responded really well, and there have been people making gains and identifying, actually, this is the market we want to aim for. They might not be in Tesco, might be in Tesco, but they've identified other markets. And again, I think what Robinson's is doing is a huge testament to Jana and the crew in Robinson's, but also a testament to our producers.
Yes, and I was going to come on to Robinson's because one of the things that I suppose has surprised me is that ShopRite's advertising and promotion and branding over, it must be, well, it is decades, isn't it? Many decades. I actually feel as though I'm in some way cheating by going into other stores now, because I've got so used to being an absolute clear, committed, passionate supporter of buying Manx food that I find it quite difficult. And Robinsons, of course, have taken up that mantle, as you say, and obviously they've invested in Ross Bakery, I think, so they've expanded the Manx bread sector after we unfortunately lost Ramsey Bakery. So and as you say, there are lots of opportunities. We've got farmers markets here as well. Yeah.
Oh, look, absolutely. And I think that's the thing which I really need to make sure the department is really working with the local producers to identify as many opportunities in events or things that people can have the opportunity to put and be front and centre with the amazing stuff they do. I mean, obviously, we're at the Southern for the next couple of days. We've got an amazing range of local producers being able to front to our communities and our people coming to the Southern Show for the next couple of days, where they can actually say, here's what we do. This is the amazing product we have. Sample it.
One of the exciting things that you will have discovered is that government doesn't always work in a seamless and united fashion. And of course the big issue that's arisen latterly in relation to the agricultural industry is the DOI, who has a very difficult and tight budget, and they've decided unilaterally perhaps that actually they need to recover their costs from the farmers. That's quite a difficult conversation for you to have, because you will know in DEFA what it's like trying to manage a difficult and tight budget. How have you approached this?
Oh, look, it is one of those very difficult situations where our colleagues in DOI, they have very tight budgets. They're trying to really make the best of what they've got. I know that the proposal that's out there, it has caused a lot of concern and questions. I would just like to acknowledge that right throughout, DOI has really been working really positively and constructively with us. We appreciate that. We're also working with the Farmers Union and others who have a view on this. End of the day, I want to make sure that we've left no stone unturned to have an outcome that actually makes sense for everyone. And actually, at the end of the day, we need to make sure it makes sense for the communities. That, we can't have something that's going to be so astronomically high, which then puts a lot of pressure on people. A lot of the underpinning framework and rules around fallen stock are there for a reason. They're there for actually very good reasons, which we've all experienced in years gone by around BSE and everything else. But I've got every confidence that we will be able to land something which is in a better place. And I just want to acknowledge the way in which DOI and the Farmers Union have been working, I think, is a sign of good, constructive, collaborative spirit.
And of course that tends to be the way that problems get solved. It's relatively easy to stand on the rooftops and shout, but the harder bit is sitting around a table and trying to find compromises.
Yep. But I think that's the thing, is that we have to talk to each other, whether it's across government or on this amazing island. We have to be able to talk to each other in a safe way, a free and frank way. And that's something it's been absolutely impressive since I've been on the island. I've got out around the traps quite a bit. I really do prefer to be out with the people that matter, with the people who are actually working the land or actually hard graft to actually deliver something back to their families and for the island. And I've been so impressed, just the openness that people have welcomed myself, my wife, to the island, but also just the free and frank views that people have shared with me. I need that. I need to understand what makes sense for people, and I need to understand how I can ensure the department actually makes sense for people and actually delivers on their, what they would like from us.
And of course, in certain respects, Brexit has had its problems in terms of interrupting food supplies and possibly leading to increased prices, but that there are also potential benefits associated with this too. A number of the policies that have been introduced over many years across the old Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, and latterly DEFA, have been introduced because these are EU-wide policies. I mean, are there opportunities? I imagine there will be some obvious opportunities for the fisheries sector, but are there other opportunities that the department is beginning to discover?
Yes, and again, you always need to approach things where where can we seize the opportunities or create opportunities. And everything that I've seen since I've been in play is there is significant opportunity for us to make sure that whatever solutions we're working upon, they have to be for the Isle of Man. They have to be for this island. We cannot accept just freely adopting new schemes and rules that are fundamentally based on someone else's methodology and someone else's data. So what I'm really focused upon is making sure that whatever we're working upon actually makes sense for us here on the island. And we're rolling out and trialing the carbon toolkit around the agricultural sector. That's fundamentally about us having data and information for the Isle of Man. It's not about us making calls, in which are big calls in terms of how we think about our carbon footprint and using data from across the UK or the EU. What I'm about is I want to make sure we have the right evidence base for us here on the island to allow us to make the right choices and decisions, and that has to be grounded on data from the island. And I'm looking forward to making sure that we can be far more data rich and evidence rich from island data and evidence for us to make the right calls for the island long term.
And you talk about long term. If you were I was going to say a betting man, or if you had a crystal ball in front of you, where would you hope to see at least the Manx food sector? And of course we haven't really talked a lot about fisheries, but bearing in mind we're at an agricultural show, that's understandable, I hope. Where would you see us being in 10 years' time?
I would really hope, and if I can boil it down, because I tend to be quite a pragmatic, practical sort of person, I boil it down for where I'd want a lot of our communities and farmers and families to be. In 10 years' time, I would love the young people on the island to have far greater optimism and thinking, that's where I want to work. I want to work within the agriculture sector. I want to work in the seafood sector. I see a future there. I would love to have the situation where far more of our families can be making the right commercial calls, where they can be investing in themselves, rather than what we have here, where I feel as those people are not investing in themselves because they just have so much uncertainty. In 10 years' time, I'm looking forward to when people have far greater optimism, they're investing in themselves, they're employing more locally, investing in our communities, and fundamentally our young people are not thinking about having to leave the island for their future, but are thinking about living on the island, working the land and working in our communities for their future.
That was DEFA Chief Officer Scott Gallagher. We'll hear from the Farmers Union after the break. You're listening to Perspective, and on today's programme we're looking at food and farming. Ian Parsons is a beef and sheep farmer and president of the Manx National Farmers Union. I caught up with Ian and the union's General Secretary, Sarah Comish, at the Southern District Agricultural Show. If we begin with, where would you say things are at in terms of agriculture and the Manx food sector?
I think, to be fair, for a number of years, certainly for the last 4 or 5 years, agriculture on the Isle of Man has been very stagnant. But I really do worry that this last sort of year, 18 months, it's actually in decline. there's several sectors are now down at the sort of single point of failure. And it's the first time I can really recall that there's usually, of the different sectors of Manx agriculture, there's usually one buoyant and going really well, one sort of stagnating and one struggling. But all sectors of agriculture just at the moment, without sounding too doom and gloom, just seem to be struggling. They really do.
And well, I suppose the obvious question then: what do you put this down to? What's causing every sector in Manx agriculture to be in that position?
I think, in generally, which lots of businesses in the Isle of Man will be facing, it's the sheer sort of costs of production, the input costs, and not seeing the return for those products have gone up. Like, they have gone up, but not in line with what the costs have gone up. We've seen obviously a major shift in the last 12, well, I suppose it's not quite 12 months, but 10 months with Tesco, the acquisition of Shoprite Group, and certainly with fruit and veg, that's had a massive impact, and so much so that I think it could nearly see the end of that sector.
I suppose most people listening to this programme will think, well, actually, we've had massive food inflation. Food prices have been going up and up and up. What are the farmers complaining about?
Well, I think it's fair to say that food prices have been going up and up at the supermarket and when consumers buy food. And whilst they have risen at farm gate prices, they haven't risen in line with what the costs of production have. And we have many more regulations and administration work, which adds an extra cost to the job. And also, like, labour shortage, it's massive. But, I know we're not the only industry on the island that's suffering these problems.
I remember back in the day when I was agriculture minister, we went to a food conference. A very, very honest, presumably he was about to retire, senior executive in a supermarket basically said, well, we follow all the various surveys and studies of agricultural businesses, and what we tend to do is we pay farmers on the assumption that they are in the top third in terms of their productivity. If they're in the top third, they'll make a profit. If they're in the middle third, they'll break even. And if they're in the bottom third, they'll make a loss. And we know exactly where they are. We know about input prices and this and that. So that's how we base our food prices. Is that something that you're familiar with?
Yes, certainly. And I think we've got lots of farmers in the Isle of Man that are in that top third. But compared to our UK counterparts, we've just got that increased cost of production and that increase of finding markets. Whilst there's no way we can gear agriculture to produce solely what the Isle of Man requires, it would make it sort of unviable in certain sectors. So there's sort of surplus produce in some sectors which has to be exported, and it's quite topical at the moment, but that cost of the transportation on and off the Isle of Man is absolutely crucifying for the industry too, along with, as I say, many other industries.
And Sarah, I mean, you obviously you're the one that makes it all happen for the Farmers Union in terms of organising meetings and being there and taking notes and making sure everyone knows what they're talking about. You'll have been quite busy in the last year or so.
Yeah, there's definitely it seems like it never really stops at the moment. We seem to have a number of challenges popping up quite a frequent basis. So we'd certainly different elements as well coming together with there's a lot of different challenges coming at farming now as well, but that route to market and that cost of production is more problematic on the island than when we look further afield. When we look to the UK and Wales and Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, there's a bigger challenge on Ireland definitely, and that's putting a lot of pressure on farms.
Because of course Isle of Man steam packets is your main route to and from the Isle of Man for inputs coming in, so that would be things like fertilisers and foodstuffs, so animal feeds and the like, and it's also the main source of export, because quite frankly we don't eat enough of the products in the Isle of Man that we produce to be able to just sell to the local market.
Yeah, and I think, in our ideal world, we'd have a much stronger home market. And there's certainly a lot of areas that we could be working on in that respect, including government's own procurement. It will be really good to see now that they've committed to having more sort of investment in local businesses, that is actually your local produce. But also that, we've just commissioned a report looking at the comparative freight costs to and from different islands around the world, and it was quite clear to us that the Isle of Man steam packet, as the charges don't really align with anywhere else in the world, and they're significantly higher, and that's a cost that the industry's had to bear for a long time.
So what I'm sure what the Isle of Man steam packet might say is that if you compare apples with pears, you get a different result to comparing apples with apples, and they would argue that serving a relatively small island community, you inevitably it's going to cost more than if you were serving a large market. So, for example, the ferries between England or Holyhead and Ireland are going to be an awful lot cheaper than the shorter distance to the Isle of Man, simply because there's more business on those routes.
Yeah, and to a certain extent that's true. However, when we looked at this, we thought, well, even if the costs of shipping on and off the island for the industry were double what they are from those busy, more intensive routes, that would be a more manageable amount. But the calculations we did demonstrated that actually the fare prices are way exceed even double the cost of anywhere else. We based it on cost per mile, because that seemed to be the most fair assessment, and we based it on standard fares, which are published by the steam packet. So we feel quite confident that the numbers we had in our report, they'll bear out to the industry.
So what's the solution, would you say, to the woes that the industry are facing? Where do we go from here?
That's a really difficult one, and I wish I did have the answer. There's sort of several things that need to be done, I think. First of all, the home market is the best market. We produce some of the best food in the world. It would be great to see more and more produce sold over here. Obviously, I would suggest around about 70 to 80% of the consumer spend will be through one group now, in the Tesco group. Whilst they have engaged and have talked, we need action as well. It's always going to be difficult to produce food in the Isle of Man at the sort of discounted rates that sometimes Tesco's want to put on promotion, and we're seeing that really alarmingly with fruit and vegetables this last sort of 6 to 8 weeks. There's absolutely no way that the local producers can produce at the costs that Tesco's are buying from large places across, and also they're not really taking into account the transportation onto the Isle of Man. So obviously we need greater buy-in from them. They've been tremendously supportive of the dairy sector and the produce they sell from the creameries, but we could do with them obviously stocking and supporting the industry more with other products. But also it's that access to market as well off island. And initially, whilst we'd like to see some mechanism of help with that, even if initially the agricultural industry could be offered fares that are already offered to other people, that would be a massive saving. The sort of costs that trailers are coming in at certain supermarkets is probably half the rate of if we're transporting breeding stock off the Isle of Man. So even just being offered that equivalent fare structure to start off with would be a massive benefit, because there's some really top quality breeding stock on the Isle of Man that go off for further breeding, and there's also stock go off for further rearing, and the cost of that is just it really is it can't continue. It's just like it's on sort of breeding cattle, it'll be towards £140 a head just for the transportation off the island.
And I mean, you've mentioned there Tesco. There is an opportunity here as well, isn't there? In that formerly Tesco had one store on the island, and with one store, it's easy to sort of say, well, we can't have special policies just for the Isle of Man because we've only got the one store, and we have to make sure that we comply with all the standards and everything else that we have for our stores across the rest of the British Isles. It's a bit different now because they do have an awful lot more of the stores on the island, and presumably that brings a certain responsibility to Tesco.
Yes, absolutely. And also, we shouldn't just really pick on Tesco either. We have Co-op with a serious number of stores. We have Marks and Spencers that have a real consumer draw. And the support from them is very, very poor as well. In fact, it's probably worse than Tesco. But yes, I think Tesco, now that they've got the number of stores they have got a major responsibility to work with the industry. I read a statistic previous to when they only had one store on Lake Road, and that had 47% of the consumer spend on the Isle of Man. Whilst I appreciate probably the consumer spend in that one store will have diluted out with the other stores, as I say, I would imagine they'll be at 70 to 80% consumer spend now. So I really do think there has to be more work done, and there needs to be a political will as well to engage and help with this, because otherwise I seriously do think, I'm not trying to be too negative, but the outlook for the agricultural industry is really quite bleak unless there is something done soon.
Just then, to help people listening who maybe haven't got in-depth knowledge of how agricultural economics works, how much as a farmer would you get for the food that you produce, as an overall sort of proportion? I mean, I presume it'll be different across different sectors and there will be variations, but roughly where are we on that?
That's really difficult, but on average I would say a farmer would probably receive just under 30% of what a consumer pays. But that is really sort of quite hard to quantify, but on lots of products it would be around about 30% of what the consumer pays.
And I guess that people might be quite surprised to learn that, because surely to goodness the most difficult and expensive and risk intense bit is producing the food, because if you have a summer like we've just had where the grass starts to grow and then it gets blasted by these northerly winds and you get an awful lot of rain and not an awful lot of sun, it must be difficult to manage your farms.
Absolutely, and I think the one thing to try and get across that's quite unique with agriculture is we do not set our selling price. Our input costs are all dictated to us, and our selling price is dictated to us. So when input costs rise, most other businesses will put 10% on what they sell and pass that on. Whereas in the agricultural industry, we cannot do that. Our selling price is set to us. So effectively, all you've got to do is try and be as efficient as you can with that little bit that's left in the middle, by trying to be more efficient, sometimes by trying to grow your business. But ultimately, the sides keep getting pushed in, and that gap in the middle is getting narrower and narrower, and it's really something is going to have to change with that.
And of course, we've mentioned already that there's loads of meetings needing to be had. There's lots of issues that need to be dealt with, Sarah, but presumably with the pressure on the agricultural industry, there's less and less money available, possibly less and less people to actually come to the meetings. That adds to the pressure on the Farmers Union.
Well, I think actually, conversely, with the added pressures that are on, I think the union, its support is stronger for the union these days. We've certainly increased the membership in the last couple of years, and I'm really hoping that our membership and those that are interested in joining can see the value of being part of the union. We certainly do get quite good attendance at meetings, and I think it's not just talking about the business of what we need to do politically and for the industry. Sometimes when we have our branch meetings, it's really a chance for farmers to get out and speak to other farmers and make it a bit of a social, because that element of it sometimes gets forgotten as well, that with all of these pressures on the industry, the pressures on the mental health is also there, and I think sometimes it just helps to get out and talk to other people about what's going on. Because
of course, back in the day when I was a young fella growing up on farms, most farmers relied on their neighbours to come round and help, and it still happens to a certain extent, but maybe not to the extent that it used to back in the olden times, where labour was a much more essential element of the farming calendar than maybe it is these days.
Yeah, and I think that's an element also that sort of shows you the pressure that individual businesses are under. You know, that those resources get more scarce, don't they? And I think that's sometimes where you find that farmers helping each other out. They do it wherever they can and however they can, but it just gets harder and harder.
One thing that we had been told over the course of the last 10 years was Brexit was going to be a godsend for the food sector. Fishing and farming were all going to benefit as a result of Brexit. Is that actually coming to pass, or is the opportunity just lingering around the corner?
Well, I think one thing I'd like to say about Brexit is, as an industry, we were told that as a result of coming out of obviously we weren't in the EU, but we have to, with the Protocol 3 trading agreement, that we would see a reduction in regulation and administration, but we certainly haven't seen that. I suppose it's very difficult. We haven't really seen any kind of benefit from it as of yet, but it's been a very difficult world we've all been living in this last 4 or 5 years, hasn't it? And there's, with the Ukraine crisis and different things, that's all probably clouded any being able to see what the benefit or non-benefit of coming out of the EU has been. So on farm, on island, no, I wouldn't say we've seen much of a difference at all, except it's very, very noticeable that we all commodities now are very much based on a global market, which is very, very volatile now. We used to not see great fluctuations in prices, whereas now, certainly in sort of cereals and dairy, we are seeing quite huge fluctuations in world trade, cheese markets, in grain markets, and that ultimately has to have a knock-on the Isle of Man. Things that we can have no effect of whatsoever really can have an impact on farm businesses' ability to sell at a reasonable price.
And of course, what is also quite important for us to realise, I mean, the Isle of Man government seems to rely on a good and reliable ferry service as providing food security. This seems to be at least part of the thinking now, but the UK is not self-reliant in food, is it?
No, absolutely. The UK is nowhere near self-sufficient in food, so I think that's a very narrow-minded outlook by the government, and it's been stated in Tynwald several times that the new boat provides food security. In fact, I think it was even said once by our own agricultural minister. But the UK is nowhere near self-secure in food production, and our government needs to realise that food's got to travel a long way up the UK before it gets to Heysham to travel to the Isle of Man. So if there is shortages, and I truly believe in the next 10 years there will be shortages of food, and supermarket shelves will be empty at times, and we saw that initially with the Ukraine crisis, we saw it at times during COVID. But I don't think it'll be just because of world events like that going forward. The world population is growing, the area of the world to produce food is reducing, and the Isle of Man could see itself very, very vulnerable going forward, and it's a case of use it or lose it for the agricultural industry, I think, in the Isle of Man right now.
And of course, one of the things that we had before Brexit, I'm doing it now, Brexit, is you had a relatively cheap labour supply that could come to and from the rest of Europe with relative ease. As you have already described, what happens with the agricultural industry inevitably is wages get driven down, particularly for fairly menial tasks like picking fruit, picking vegetables, whatever it might be. So one of the poorest paid parts of the food sector, and of course we now can't rely on those people coming to pick the fruit and the veg that's produced in a much larger extent than it is on the Isle of Man. But we also have a similar problem in terms of fish processing on the island, of struggling to find the relatively low paid workers prepared to do the work. Again, on the island we have almost full employment. There's very few people unemployed, and certainly more jobs than there are workers. All these things make it more and more difficult for you, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Labour is seriously short in the Isle of Man, as I said before, with many other sectors, hospitality and different things. But I think with regard to on UK farms, because of this labour shortage, you've seen big expansion of enterprises, especially in fruit and vegetable production, with really mechanised high-tech equipment to replace some of that labour shortage. But that sort of equipment costs so much money and is so expensive that there's no way that can be justified on the Isle of Man on the scale that we are farming at. So it really is a problem over here, and it's only going to get worse because that sort of kit, their starting price is £250,000 for fruit picker machines and vegetable picker machines for some of the fancier kit. Well, that sort of investment just cannot be done on farms the scale of the Isle of Man.
Okay, then we're coming towards the end of the programme. If you had a magic wand, what are the top things on the Manx National Farmers Union's wish list?
I think the top thing would be to see more locally produced food consumed locally, both by government and by the consumers. Obviously, it's got to be at a price that the consumer can afford, because fully appreciate there's lots of people out there with hardship, but I think it needs to be recognised the margin, the proportion of what the consumer pays that the farmer receives needs to be increased, and the big supermarkets and retailers maybe have to look at the percentage that they receive themselves and they profiteer from. So that would be number one. I think would be a greater political buy-in to Manx agriculture. We do have an element of support, but really, the Isle of Man, we all rave about this lovely, beautiful island, and that is as a result of what the farming industry does. And I think we need probably a greater political buy-in, both for food security and for maybe government to take food security seriously.
And what would that political buy-in look like? Because, of course, if you asked any of our MHKs, do you support the Manx agricultural sector, they'd all say, yes, of course we do. So what specifically are you looking for?
Well, I think it's an appreciation of what the industry provides, and we're seeing it just lately with the DOI's increase on animal disposal, trying to just pass that cost straight over onto the farming industry. To me, that's not great political buy-in for what the industry produces, because they're just trying to shift more costs over onto the industry and more regulation. So we also look at procurement. Government is the biggest feeder of people every day in the Isle of Man, between schools, prison, hospitals. Well, certainly if we take our elderly and our children, if we cannot provide them with a good, healthy, locally produced, seasonal product, then they should be the most important elements of the population that we should be feeding well. And whilst it might be sourced locally, it's not necessarily produced locally. And I suppose that brings us round to food labelling as well. I think there is a lot of there's a lot of the local consumers do genuinely think they are buying local products when actually they're not. But that is, it's through no fault of their own. It's purely down to we need a credible food labelling so people know that what they're buying, whether it is either just being processed on the Isle of Man or generally produced on the Isle of Man.
And finally, I'm not sure whether I dare ask this question, where do you see the agricultural sector in 10 years' time?
Well, I'm usually the eternal optimist, and I'm going to still try and stay optimistic, because I seriously think for the UK, food security is going to be a major issue in the next 10 years. So long as the industry can hang on long enough, there will be demand for that, because supermarkets are really going to have to change their approach to purchasing food. But my real worry is on the Isle of Man is whether all sectors of the industry will be able to hang on for that point.
Well, at that, I think we'll have to go, because the sheep shearing demonstration is about to start. We're sat on the sheep shearing table, and I haven't got an awful lot left to get sheared off, so... Some pretty stark warnings there from Manx National Farmers Union President Ian Parsons, backed up by his union's General Secretary Sarah Comish. So what do you think? Are you worried about the future security of food supplies to the island? Is the cost of food a bigger concern for you? If you're involved in the food and farming sector, are you encouraged by DEFA Chief Scott Gallagher's positive messages? Can the Isle of Man afford to allow its food sector to continue to decline? Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now, I'm Phil Gaughan. Goramaos and Geisio Grum. Thanks for listening.